We are delighted to welcome again, and I say again because Judith Barrington was our third reader when the Milwaukie Poetry Series was just starting in January of 2008, and I actually remember a little of that reading. So, which was a very good reading. So we are delighted to have Judith back. She has published 4 poetry collections, including most recently, Judith has a new book out, The Conversation. There are going to be books for sale here in the rear after the reading, and Judith will be available for signing. And also 2 chapbooks, Postcards from the Bottom of the Sea and Lost Lands, which was the winner of the Robin Becker Chapbook Award. She won the Gregory O'Donoghue International Poetry Prize for 2013. Among her other awards are the Stuart Holbrook Award for Outstanding Contributions to Oregon's Literary Life, jointly with Ruth Gundel, the Portland Poetry Festival First Place Award, and an American Civil Liberties Union Freedom of Expression Award. She is also the author of Life Saving, a memoir, which is the winner of the Lambda Book Award and runner-up for the Penn Martha Albrand Award for her memoir. Judith teaches all over the USA, Britain, Spain, and has been a faculty member at the NFA program at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. It's quite a resume. We're delighted to have Judith as our poet. Would you join me in welcoming our poet for tonight, Judith Barrington?
Might have to put this up because I usually do have to. Can you hear at the back? Yes. Oh, good. I don't have to mess with that then. That's excellent. First of all, I really want to thank Tom for this series. It's a wonderful addition to the literary life of our area, and it's great for the audiences. The only time I've been to many of the readings here, and I gave one way back when it started. And I like to see new people going to readings. I mean, readings aren't necessarily new to you, but you are new to me, because I don't want to read to little people. Talking with Paul Ann about this, how as a poet, it's great to give readings where we read with a group of people who've been part of a book or somehow are connected, and it reminds us that we're a community of writers, and I love to do that. But it's also a real gift to be given a span of time to actually read more than 8.5 minutes, when you're always kind of jittery because you might go over your time and read 9 minutes, and then everybody will hate you. So I'm very happy to be part of this series, which I think is a wonderful one. And to thanks also to all the volunteers. I know volunteers make many things happen, and also for the gift of the broadside, a little poem that's handed out, which is also a lovely idea. So thanks for all that and more. I'm going to read almost entirely from this new book, The Conversation, which was published by Salmon Press in Ireland. They like to boast that they're the only publisher that has an address that has no numbers in it. Their address is Salmon Poetry, Cliffs of Moher, County Clare, Ireland. I'm dying to go there. Anyway, so I'm going to read from this collection. I'll start with this poem called When Did It Start? When did it start? This shouting of the body. Hold me, touch me, place your warm hand on my emptiness. When did it start? This conversation with the world, so different from conversations made with words. Words say, this will pass. The body says, listen. Words say, tomorrow. The body says, now. In December 19, not 19, I think I'm in the wrong century here. In December 2013, I had a very sudden and quite inexplicable brain bleed. After waiting in the hospital almost a week, with the surgeons being very reluctant to do a dangerous surgery, I faded to within what my neurologist told me was within 3 hours of dying. So finally I was whisked away into surgery and had a piece of my head cut out and recovered over a period of 1.5 years. I mostly can think now. I don't always remember things, but then who does at my age? Anyway, after I had the surgery, I was amazed to how successful it in fact turned out to be. Apparently, I was not ready to go. Yeah, thank goodness I say the same, thank you. Ready or not. When is anyone ready to face the moon, to stride up the dark avenue and look into inevitable light? Some have turned back, babbling of the whiteness they saw there, the dazzle at the threshold she guards. I wasn't ready, they say. I had more to do, they say. 1 in a million will be granted an extension. The rest of us go on wondering when she might call. She gleams under a tree or above the inverted V of a roof where rain putters, each percussive drop a distraction from what must come. When I've forgotten her altogether, out she hops and locks onto my shoulder like an angry parrot. Her claws dig in. I'm not ready, I say. Brain surgery. There it goes, the line of the road, unraveling over flatlands, poplars like sentries guarding each side from cars that might swerve if a driver nodded off, might plunge across the ditch to end nose down in a furrow of mud. There it goes, rolling into the distance as it always has. No warning signs, no crossroads, hills, or blind bends. No piles of rock slipping down non-existent banks to block the highway. I could be forgiven for thinking, as most do, that this line girdles my whole planet, that I can see everything ahead. Couldn't I be excused for confusing the line with the life, for forgetting that somewhere the road must scale a range of mountains, swerve around the trunks of giant sequoias, enter a darkness where anything might leap from forest or gorge? You never know what's coming. So in this book, as you may already have realized from this very short beginning, there are quite a number of poems that were described by the late great poet and friend of mine, Maxine Cumin. Deathy poems, she called them. Deathy poems. Deathy. It's hard to say that. Deathy poems. As we get older, she said, and she died a couple years ago now, we write more of them. This book includes deathy poems, brought on by my close call with the Reaper, but also memories of loved ones who have died, both long ago and recently. Earlier this year, my sister died after being in a nursing home for her final years. This poem I'm going to read now came from the last time I visited her, when she was still living in her home in England, though she was well into dementia. I'm not being overcome with emotion here, but when I read poems, I always have to blow my nose. There's something about reading poetry. It just makes my nose run. And I'm not allergic to poetry, I can tell you. This is called My Sister, who used to be a concert pianist. What I will remember is how she sat there, a little hunched over, watching the birds, pointing suddenly at a crow, or the cows that wander up to the fence, dividing lawn from pasture. She had grown not old, but ancient in my absence. While I flew north or down to San Francisco, while I walked my dog up Mount Tabor on unsteady, painful legs, solid chunks of her memory were falling out, leaving spaces like doorways or window squares in the crumbling walls of a ruined cathedral. What happened to the urge that used to propel her into the forest or up the path to the beacon with Humbert, who bounded as eagerly as she strode in those shoes she still called plimsolls? What I will recall is her back view, nothing visible except dirty gray hair, shorter than it was in its wildly tangled days, chopped off by an impatient social worker one Wednesday afternoon. She might be any very old woman, smiling, I know, even though I can't see her face, the smile that used to reveal her joy at the hound pointing his nose towards a bird or the scent in a briny wind. An old woman who now waves her hand at a black and white cow, reaching over the fence to sweeter grass. A revenant who, when she was young, sat me on her long thighs and read to me. A bout, she would say, is not a boat. Look at the vowels. But I squirmed away, shouting, a boat, a boat. So she returned to those meticulous Bach phrases spelled out by the touch of her long fingers. What I will see when I'm home again is not the violence of the haircut, but the elegant hand lifting, wrist first, as if flourishing up from the keys, her perfect fugue complete. There are also poems in here of other family members, some of whom are still alive and some of whom have departed. And among them, to my great surprise, there are a few poems about my father, who had never until recently deigned to appear in a poem. But he came along, and so there are 2 or 3 about my dad who it was difficult to write about. What kind of creature? How can you miss someone who's always there, drumming his fingers on the dinner table, turning his key in the lock at the same time each day? In spite of their presence, in my generation, the fathers seemed to be missing, leaving us to wonder what kind of creature a father might be. What feelings swirled beneath the occasional rages, jittery impatience, even the penchant for casting a line into water where fish were said to lurk. Mine was one of those unknowns, not that I noticed his absence until later, when I wondered about those weekend days he spent alone in a rowboat, surrounded by frog song and wild azaleas, throwing out his hand-tied fly and thinking. Or did he perhaps go there not to think, but to cast out the contracts, the draftsman's arguments, the need to smile at the elderly bookkeeper, along with the lightweight line that played out with the flick of his wrist and lay down feather light and straight, not so much as rippling the surface? On those days, his head must have been filled with nothing more than the smiling trout, whose lips sooner or later would swirl and grab, buckle the rod, squirm in the net, and ease into shining death at his feet. Sometimes people ask me if my many poems that are written about the undersea world have anything to do with the fact that my parents drowned in the ocean. When they asked me, I used to say no, it wasn't that, since I had loved the ocean even before that happened. But now I'm not quite so certain. I keep on writing about oceans and the underwater life. Some of my imaginative underwater explorations could be perhaps influenced by the fact that that's where they went, that's where they ended up. I got a generous invitation a few years back to spend time in residence at the Mark Hatfield Science Center in Newport, the Marine Science Center. And it allowed me, when I stayed down there, to go deeper, at least in my imagination, to down under the water and to discover sea creatures I found that, oddly, I could identify with. The octopus. Master of stealth and disguise, he shoots away, leaving behind an inky alter ego. Once I perfected his art, I became a true master, ducking and weaving, obscured by a cloud of something like ink that surrounded my head. Was it grief or something less worthy that sent me scuttling off in a flurry of sand, leaving my shadowy image behind to shake hands and smile, to wake and to sleep, untouched by the weight of the deep? This next poem, which is also in the center section of this book, and they're all ocean-related poems. This next one was inspired by a photograph in a book that I like very much. It's a book called Shipwreck, and it's photographs, period photographs, a lot of them from around the turn of the 19th century, the 1900s, with photographs and also with text by John Fowles, who is one of my favorite writers. So this poem was inspired by one of the photographs in that book. It's a photograph of a sailing ship that foundered and went down. The poem is called Elegy for Mildred, and when I was writing it, I tried to recreate the classical elegy form, which has lines that alternate between 6 and 5 accents, stresses, which I found very difficult to do and was quite hard on my ear. So hope it's not hard on your ears. Okay, Elegy for Mildred. The epigraph reads, struck off Gurnard's Head, Cornwall, at midnight, April 6, 1912. Sometimes the wrecks are layered on top of older wrecks in this most deadly 10 square miles of sea. Mildred was Cornish built, 3-masted, hauling slag, her spars dark in the fog, her canvas slack. When the cry came, breakers ahead, the panicking crew ran through the night, trying to come about, while some climbed high in the rigging, assuming the ship was lost. The captain hollered up and promised safety, a boat they could all escape in, a sea calm in the fog. Indeed, they rowed along the coast and landed safe at St. Ives. On the cliffs, in dawn's clear light, the crowds gathered to watch as Mildred, upright still, settled into her bed. Local wreckers muttered, "Her cargo's useless, nothing to gain from the carcass, nor even her sails." But lovely they were, those sails, their rigging draped like skirts, and the topmost spars already forming across, as if her grave were waiting below, waiting for surf to break her back and part her seams and lick at the joints of the wheel and the gimbal ring of the compass, till dishes and socks and barrels of grog and charts that were useless to steer her home, all would slowly let go and spiral down to settle in sand. Pieces of Mildred, barnacle laden, lie there still, the last of her elegance underneath mounds of silt, her shipwright's art forever lost to brine and time and waves that beckon and moan, beckon and grieve. Even my ship poems are deathy. I'm sorry. I never realized that until now. but she lives anyway. It's always very tempting when one gives a reading to try out a bit of new work. At the moment, what I'm working on is a book of kind of memoir, but it's also about oceans, believe it or not. I like to say it's a kind of a hybrid between prose poem and lyric essay. I realize this is a poetry series, but I'm taking a little dispensation to read a short piece of poetic prose out of this new work. The book is organized in the sections that are each about an ocean. So the first section is the English Channel, where I grew up. The second section is the Mediterranean. The third is the Pacific, and the last section is the Atlantic. What I'd like to read you is the very opening of the second section that's called Mediterranean. My mother was never happier than when she was beside the Mediterranean Sea. One night when I was 14, she walked back with me from the park in the center of Caldetas, Spain, to our hotel on the north end of the village. Our narrow path lay between the wall at the top of the beach to our right and a row of grand old villas on our left. The almost full moon glinted off wavelets that broke quietly out of the luminescence through which we had swum a night or two earlier with our friends, weaving brilliant green trails around and between us. But on this night, it was just the two of us wandering along, hardly noticing a nostalgic tune drift out from one of the villas, where shadowy figures sat in an alcove draped with bougainvillea and lined with cracked blue tiles. A champagne cork popped, and a burst of laughter cut through the midnight air. The song playing over and over was Green Fields, which was popular that summer. I had noticed that my mother reacted to it with a kind of sadness that might have been a happy sadness, so I had learned to play it on my guitar. On that walk, she didn't say much, but I knew she was thinking of the house in Barcelona where she and my father had lived for many years and where my brother and sister had been born. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, the four of them had fled to England, where I was born later. Spain had become a lost paradise for my mother, a definition that I inherited without question. Surely I could hardly feel real nostalgia for life in the Barcelona house that, when I tracked it down much later, it did look a lot like those old seafront villas in Caldetas. But somehow I seemed to have a longing for that past I hadn't shared. Could these sights and sounds have lain dormant in my genetic code until they quickened at the first glimpse of the green sea? Spain, I knew it as intimately as if I'd been there all along. When my mother died by drowning 5 years after that night in Caldetas, it was not in the Mediterranean. Of course, her death would have been a disaster, no matter which ocean it was that grabbed and swallowed her. But I can't help thinking it would have been a separate tragedy if she had died in the waters she had loved so unequivocally. A tragedy for her, and perhaps for me too, since my escape from grief, fleeing for 3 years to live beside those waters, would never have worked. As an unplanned remedy, though, Mediterranean brought a kind of relief. I was reliving an infatuation that had been my mother's before I made it my own. Working at Peralada Castle as a tour guide in the wine cellars, I raced in my dead mother's car down the road to Rosas, baked in the hot sun under my dead mother's beach umbrella, burned my shoulders crossing the bay in a pedalo, as I had done with my dead mother in Caldetas. And at the same time, I was exploring that coast, just as my joyfully alive mother had explored it before I was born. It was a completely different ocean that had killed her. Then there was the body, or bodies, I should say, bodies of sun-drenched, salt-encrusted skin, my own and others, bodies of water warmly embracing, playfully slapping, tossing me onto sand, and escorting me back into the greater body that rocked and heaved with pleasure. Pleasure was falling backwards into it, or plunging headfirst into its unknown parts. Pleasure was the circling hand of Carmen, coaxing suntan lotion into my back, while I hid my face, smiling into a rough towel at the forbidden pleasure. Or it was the pressure of Francisco's flushed and eager body pressing into my side, or the lingering gaze of a stranger lolling against a wooden post with his hand tugging the top of his emerald trunks, offering a scene I could conjure up later in my iron bedstead that squeaked rhythmically in my shady room on the 3rd floor. And the hungry body, always hungry for silence and for touch, yet filled only with the disgust of an abandoned body whose mother is gone, whose parents have whirled away into the great oceanic corpse, leaving her behind. Hungry for the blood of red wine, the amber of brandy, the ripeness of sangria, one bottle following another, until they chased her into oblivion, chased her out into the depths where the treacherous parents filled their lungs and slept. Down she sank into weed and currents, into the darkness where nothing she wanted could be found. And then, still hungry, every morning her body surfaced to step into sunlight and hold between both hands the giant white cup of foaming café con leche. Every day, still thirsty. All right, back to real poetry. That's the first time I've read that aloud. Made me hot. So I'm going back to the conversation, and it seems to me that I should read you the title poem. I haven't been reading it at all my readings because I thought it was a poem that's difficult to grasp just on one hearing. But people have told me that I'm incorrect about that. So I might be wrong. I might have assumed that wrong. I'm not a particularly bright listener. I don't always get poems when I hear them read one time. So I'll hope that you'll get a bit out of this anyway. This is the poem, The Conversation, that got me to Ireland to read in the International Poetry Festival there. So I owe it a lot. I should read it aloud, really. I shouldn't neglect it. It has an epigraph taken from Robert Frost's poem, Out, Out. And Robert Frost wrote, "And they, since they were not the one dead, turned to their affairs." It's not that I blame them. How often have I, too, turned back to my living life, leaving the dead to hover around in dreams, or pop into sight as a back view, walking with a familiar gait towards the park. Just because I'm dead now, I can hardly ask them to hang out nearby, lost for language, lost for gesture, lingering just to show willing. It's not even as if I have somewhere to go. I've told them often enough, the end is the end. So off you go to affairs of state or of the heart, to money worries, doctors' offices, children who threaten to turn out all wrong, or so you say. Anyway, what would we do if you stuck around here? It's too late now for that conversation we never had, though it's interesting to discover that I still wish I'd found a way to get it going. The end may be the end, though some piece of me, not quite finished, has kept the words that belong in that talk stuffed inside my mouth, which is firmly closed like my eyes, though my lids are no longer weighted with coins, bus fare into the next world, which of course does not exist. But what if a bus should come along, or a rowboat, or to cross the river, or even a cruising yellow cab? Would I get on board, curious to find out where they're headed? Take a tour like on that cold, cold bus in Granada that stops at Lorca's family home, where on August 18th they came to arrest the poet. A day later, he was dead, going nowhere except into history. No transport required. I want to say, I just pause for a moment to say that towards the end of that poem, it took a turn that was very unexpected to me. When it suddenly there's a Granada in the poem. I mean, it goes from Robert Frost to me speaking from beyond the grave to Granada and a bus and Lorca's family home, which was a shock to find myself there. So I just want to point out that sometimes it's a place that brings us into an unexpected speech in a poem. And it was definitely the bus that reminded me of Granada in Spain, and then the whole poem followed that, and there we got to the house of Lorca's family home. I'm going to be teaching a class that starts at the end of this month. It's called Landscape and Memory. And it's a bit misleading because it's not really landscape so much as it's about place and how place can lead you in to things you didn't know you were going to say, and ways into poems through places, whether they be landscape, nature, cities, an old house, any place that has a part of your history in it. So there are flyers back on the book table if you're interested in it. It's four Saturday mornings through the Mountain Riders series, and I highly recommend it. There are 2 or 3 spaces left, so grab them. Okay, well, speaking of Spain, in July 2005, I think it was, yes, 2005, I went to Madrid. I was invited to be a visiting writer in the University of New Orleans summer writing program in Madrid. So I went there for a few days. And then on the 7th of July, which happened to be my birthday, I was all set to move on to London to visit friends and family. By the time I arrived in London on the 7th of July, the streets were full of determined British people walking to work or finding their way home on their feet or lingering near the tube station that was one of the bomb sites in the terrorist attack that had just happened. In some ways, it reminded me of how those people, or the parents of those people, my parents included, had coped during the Blitz in World War II. When I began to write about this, I remembered the famous poem by W.H. Auden titled September the 1st, 1939, in which he, the poet, is sitting at a cafe in New York watching the rapid approach of World War II. That poem is very well known, and it has famous images in it, one of which is, "We must love one another or die." Although there are various versions. He took some of those rather delightful, but perhaps a little cliched lines out of the poem later. There's a line that I took from his poem called The Dense Commuters Come. And I also stole the form of the poem. I thought it was very unusual for a subject like war. It's written in 11-line stanzas, which are odd. It has 3 accents per line, which is a waltz rhythm, and usually would conjure up something light-hearted and sort of pleasant. And it has an irregular rhyme scheme, which I imitated. Imitation is a really good way to learn. As in many disasters, the media in UK and actually the world media latched on to an iconic image. You know, in every war, there's always some image. There's the photograph of the fleeing child, the photograph of somebody who somehow is always going to be connected with that disaster. And in this particular instance, it was all over the papers and television. It was a photograph of an old woman who was being helped from the bombed underground station by a helper, and she had a bandage around one eye. Here we go. I'm pretending to be Auden here. The London bombs. And it has an epigraph. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. This time, it's early July, and more than 6 decades have loosed a spate of speech where once grave tongues were tied. Deaths on the lips of each smooth-talking TV head, projecting sincerest concern at the camera's red-hot eye. A rotten smell pervades the air. Only the dead can catch the spinning lie. Survivors, poxy with soot, stumble into the light. Photographers flash at the mask of a swaddled face, white like the bandaged invisible man, except that the left eye's covered, the right a mystery. One foot in front of the other. Huddled into a stranger, she asks, "What happened?" "Don't worry, love," he says. "Hop into the van." Deep in the earth, dig and sift and chase off rats in 110-degree heat. Up top, flowers, photos of lovers who'll never be found. Handbags, odd shoes, a wig, sunglasses, half-burned hats. Rumors swirl around as dust wafts from the feet of doctors, policemen, cats from the tunnel, triumphant crows. No good asking, why do we never learn? Or what makes the young men suicidal? No good bemoaning the hate afflicting not just the idle, the disenfranchised, the poor. Before each and every war, some poet has seen the signs and sat at a table, his cry crafted too soon or too late into useless, shapely lines. I watch a small brown dog trot past the yellow tape of the crime scene, cordoned off in front of the station. The shape of attention, the hopeful wag, the whiskery head cocked to one side, all tell a story of daily meeting and greeting. But now, with his front door locked, it's buzz off, dog, and sorry, he's joined the ranks of the waiting. The dense commuters come into some new kind of life. Strap hangers said to be stoic or brave or merely numb. Which wrist veined like a leaf, which muscled calf, which ear will rip or burn in the thick of the next explosion? Fear is quiet. The human race hurtles through tunnels, its gaze averted in its bandaged face. Well, I actually had experienced bombing before. At the moment I was born. I was born in Brighton, England, on the south coast of England in 1944, the last year of the war. And there were, our city was being bombed fairly regularly, often by German bombers on their way back from bombing London or northern England. They would just drop their bombs on us before they headed across to Germany. My world, tangled like tumbleweed, barbed wire scrolls across the top of the beach. Bombs lie buried in shingle, waiting for a disobedient child to crawl through and trigger an explosion. Obedience equals life in 44. Glass, fresh flesh, brick, smash and tear and fly through smutty air. It's a female, bustling world, this house where I'm born, under the left-handed full mead moon of July. Her sinister light floods the streets. Her fingers probe the shells of crumpled homes. Bathed in her glory, old men on roofs and women driving Red Cross cars go about their work, watching for planes, digging through rubble, dragging out the bleeding, wounded. This is my world. I have to learn to love it. So, guess this need a little bit of an upper, right? I don't know. But after that childhood, I grew up with rationing. You know, we had rationing books and then houses that were missing in the street. There were just bomb sites a lot around where I lived. And then it was the 50s, which was sort of boring, and then the 60s, and the 70s, which really livened everything up quite a bit. I have a poem about each of those decades. I'm just going to read you the one about the 70s, which has an epigraph taken from Bob Dylan. Could do with a little Bob Dylan song here. This poem is called The 70s, Bob Dylan, Tangled Up in Blue. You'd think we'd have been nothing but happy. Indeed, we often speak of those days with nostalgia. Oh, how we shouted and marched and slept in musty bags on the ground beside barbed wire, beside the soldiers who guarded the war machines. You'd think we'd recall striding, arms linked, along the simmering streets, donning our costumes of shocking certainty. You'd think those might be the happiest days of all, when change flew in from the west and further west, and blind belief raised its defiant fist inside the circle. The commune seethed as lonely latched onto lonely, blueprints for friendship thrown out with the trash. Sisterhood shone bright, but cast long shadows, and tangled up we were, the barbed wire piercing skin, as we loved and hated, kissed and ran. No wonder I secretly dreamed of being alone. I drove by myself to Wales. I parked at the farm. I climbed 3 fields. Sheep looked up from the grass and shook their matted fleece and grazed again. I sat in the slate-roofed shepherd's house, beside the stream, beside the dry stone wall, beside the rowan tree where one bird called, one voice alone, whistling praise to the world. Those were the days of clearest colors, days I floated in heather's deep blue silence, breathing the dust of last night's smoky coal fire, wishing I were back with everybody else. And this other one I'm going to read you is also a sort of political activism poem. How are we doing? We're doing all right for time. It's a poem that's called Domestic Terrorist, and Domestic Terrorist in my poem, in the title, is written with quotation marks around it to make it clear that that's the way people refer to these people in my thinking about when I was writing this poem, domestic terrorists. I don't think of them that way, but they are called that often in newspapers and reports. Domestic terrorist, and this is an activity that I have never done, but I wish I had. And the first line is taken from Maxine Cumin, who wrote most wonderfully about horses. I trust them to run from me, necks arched in a full swan's S, wild ones destined for dog food cans, crammed together, nipping, humping up half bucks, too tightly packed to let fly with unshod hoofs. I trust them to flee the corral on moonless nights when I slide back the poles and whisper to them and wait. The nearest spill out sideways, startled to find the fence of their compound breached. Then muffled snorts and messages on the breath huff through the tangled mass of horseflesh. Ears come forward, mud-caked heads lift high. Duns and greys, skewballs and bays, mares with tottering foals, a sway-backed roan, surge like a tide and funnel through the straight, bursting a couple of spans each side of the gap. I trust them to scent the fragrant pastures of home. So now we have a new politics. I have often thought it wasn't really truly feminist politics, but I would say gender politics. And for me, they're somewhat less exhilarating to participate in than back in the 70s when we marched around doing damage. But they are quite useful. Whoever thought marriage would be a candidate for that? So this poem is called On Getting Married for the Third Time. Number one, I did what I was supposed to. It was expected, so I joined the crowd, tramped up the aisle in white drag, drunk, and promised unpromisable things. There was not much wrong with him, except conventional masculinity and an old-fashioned definition of the word wife. The real doozy was my being a lesbian. Yes, well before I hitched myself to the coattails of his morning suit, I had been hitching to dresses, petticoats, even those tight pencil skirts of the 50s and 60s that shortened a woman's stride but clung nicely to rounded buttocks. 11 months in, that first one hit me and threatened to expose me as a pervert. But number two was a very good man. I needed him at the time, and he graciously agreed to be needed for a couple of years. Enough said. Number three, hooray, is the real deal. Not the wedding, you understand, since there wasn't one in the usual sense. What would be the point after 34 years of building what some would call a marriage? What we built was called our life, a life of outlaws, if you think a relationship needs laws. But what we made was recognizable even to the most conventional of our neighbors. A castle with solid walls and a wide portico where an animal, our familiar in its black or red or black and white coat, would lie beside us, while the Norway maple, only 3 feet tall when the city planted it, grew right through the power lines. That tree became its own castle, with a dim interior of woven branches, mysterious to passers-by, who looked up into the maze, took photos on their iPhones, and watched blue jays and crows, squirrels and hummingbirds busy with their lives. Around year 25, the magnolia we'd bought at an auction to help pay off Marcia's medical bills finally shot up above the porch railing and saluted us where we sat with our gin and tonic at sunset, its succulent, creamy trumpets shaking the foundations of everything. So I'm going to finish with one poem more, then we'll be happy to talk or have questions or whatever. Before I read this last poem, I'd like to read you the epigraph to the whole book, at the front of the book, which reads like this: "For Ruth, without whom I would neither be alive nor feeling all the joy in each day we have together." The poem is called Long Love. Is it your legs I remember? Or that photograph of your legs? Long and skinny they were, swooping from tiny denim shorts to huge hiking boots with bright red laces. It's a wonder those legs could lift such boots, but they did, and with a grace I cannot now attribute to love-struck eyes. The thing is, when you grow old, you fail to notice your lover's legs very often. Love-struck gives way to love-soaked, a softer state in which legs are taken for granted, except if they appear without pajamas in the kitchen or require a close look for a splinter or a suspicious mole traced softly with your forefinger. Feeling the brown spot, you are struck by fear, love having grown by now into a world, the mole a potential hazard that could split your globe down the middle and leave it to float in space like a white dwarf, as the scientists call a dying star, eventually leaving nothing but another black hole. Thank you. Oh, yeah, the broadside that you have been given. It's the last poem in the book, and had we not been quite as far ahead in time as we were, I would have read it. But you have it; you can read it.
I didn't know if there was any kind of an introduction.
Actually, it rather fits what I said about place, because the place in that poem is very, very potent. It's I forget how I said it. It's a grassy, It's a gorge in the middle of the Sussex Downs that's covered in smooth grass and cropped by sheep. And it's close to where I grew up and where I rode my pony when I was a kid. And it's called the Devil's Dyke. And it's a very famous landmark, which, as I got older, I found very interesting because a lot of the streets in the back of Brighton were named for it. So there was Dyke Road, Dyke Avenue, Dyke Close. I found that very amusing when I know, pathetic sort of humor, but I had my photograph taken by some of the street names. But that's sort of by the way. But that location is in the second stanza of the poem, and it is a real example of a place being really powerful as a way to get into a poem. And the first stanza is a lot of famous places who are attached to writers or to writers have written about them, and how people always want to go back to the place of the childhood, and how it's really different actually when you go back. So thank you for asking. I think it's customary to have questions or anything, if you have any questions, or else we can talk informally. Is this what we should be doing, Tom?
Yes.
Yes.
Questions and answers.
Okay.
So, and I have one, which is your writing practice.
My writing.
Your writing practice. Has it been hard to get back to it in the last 9 months, a year?
Yeah.
How has that been? And
Well,
have you seen differences?
Yes, I write about death all the time. I came so close. But it's odd because, as you can tell, there's a few poems that I wrote after I came out of the hospital, which were about brain surgery and so on. And that was relatively soon, maybe 2 or 3 months after I got home. I was in rehab for a long time. And then I just didn't have the energy. I wanted to write. I felt it moving in me, but and I also couldn't do the stairs in my house. My writing room is at the very top. It's a converted attic. So I had to set up in the dining room in the middle of everything, which was not a very easy place to write. But only a matter of a few weeks ago, we moved my desk and everything back up into the real writing room. So I've actually got it now. And probably for the last few months, I've been writing when I feel like it. I don't have a full day in me. I don't have a full day of doing whatever. I mean, I have to sort of I do a half, a 3/4 day. But I find that I'm writing more and more now, and I'm writing differently than I used to, because I don't really have a routine. I find what I do is I write when I feel like it, actually, which is very different than when I was sort of driven to be properly, proper writer. You do this at a certain time, and I find that I'm wanting to write, so I write, and then it's different. It's a very different thing, and I feel it has changed my writing. Actually, I feel my writing is much looser and much more. I've let go in a certain kind of way, so I'm much more open to what will happen than I used to be. So that's a nice question. Thank you. Yeah.
When did you begin writing poetry, and did you find it natural when you first began, or did it be something that you forced yourself into?
No, I began writing because I wanted to. I grew up in England, and our education in England at the time was pretty good, so we got a lot of poetry and literature. And I found myself, mostly as a lot of young people do, writing things that I didn't want anyone to know, but writing a poem and hiding it, that sort of thing for quite a long time. But it seemed very natural to write a poem to me. And I tried, bad verses with lots of rhymes and things like that. And then the more I read and understood what people were writing, how people were writing in our time, I gradually moved into trying out different forms. Thank you. Anything else? Back, yes, hello.
I find it, despite the fact that I moved a lot, a sense of place really means something to me. And I'm curious, having lived in England for 8 years myself, do you split your time? Do you keep part of your life back there that you go to? Or?
I wish. I haven't been back for 3 years, but I've made my home here. But I always used to go back probably every year. I was also teaching over there sometimes, giving readings over there. But I was based here, and my home has been here for quite a long time.
It feels so different in the West in some ways, doesn't it? I mean, the Western U.S. Like
Oh yeah,
Oregon.
it's very different. Yeah, when I first came here, I felt like I was in a completely foreign country. I'll tell you, you'd have laughed if you saw me trying to figure out how to put a letter in a mailbox. It took me like half an hour to figure out where the letter went. Yeah, back there.
You made a reference to Mount Tabor.
Yeah,
What prompted that?
I live near Mount Tabor. I live near Mount Tabor.
Oh, really?
And I-
Both did too, we were both raised, right?
Oh, well, I walk my dog, or my friend walks my dog up there too. It's a good place. Yeah. Okay, do we want to break this?
Yeah.
I'm here. I was. Lemuel,
I'm curious about were your parents part of the Spanish Civil War?
No, they were.
Your parents were in Spain?
They were British. My father worked in Barcelona, and they lived there for 20-something years. But then when the war broke out, they escaped very suddenly, went back to England. Yes. Yeah.
Do you have a role model to poetry growing up?
Did I have a role model? Difficult to say. There have been poets who I've been inspired by, probably at different times. You know, Adrian Rich was important to me, and Mary Oliver, there was a period when that was important to me. I had two English teachers when I was in school, one of whom was kind and the other whom was cruel. And the kind one encouraged me, and the cruel one sent my essays back with red lines through them and said, "This is rubbish," things like that. And I think the cruel one actually helped me more than the kind one, I had to say. I'm sorry to say. So, anything else? I'm happy to sign any books and chat with you for a...
Yes, we have books
Oh.
back here,
Uh-huh.
and Ruth is going to be selling them. We have refreshments, so please
Thank you very much, Tom.
enjoy.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks.